Welcome back to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. Today, I'm joined by our first repeat guest. His name is Martin Toomey from the Offshore Consulting Group, LLC. And we decided to have Martin back on because A, it's always good talking to him and doubling down on some really important topics. But B, he got a Yeti mic. He got a new mic. So, so we thought he'd celebrate and break it in.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it. I'm sure it was just as popular with your viewers as it was with mine. I got quite a bit of good content out of our last interview, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Awesome. So you heard back from people that follow you that they enjoyed the episode?
Definitely. I'm sure more than a few of them went over and followed you as well. So
today we were thinking we would actually do a bit of a deeper dive on residency. And this is going to be a treat for our audience because I find that it's hard to get this information, especially in audio format. You know, you listen to Nomad Capitalist or something, and they'll just kind of say that like a program exists and maybe like a couple lines, but they don't really get into the details and the tactics and what's really involved. Like what appointments do you need to make? How much is it going to cost? Like where do I have to go? How many steps are there? How long do I have to wait in between steps? Things like that. So hopefully we're going to make that a little bit clearer in this episode and provide some value. First, I guess we'll talk about residency in Mexico, and then we'll take it from there. How's that sound?
it sounds great. And I'm sure you're aware of this. Mexico started cracking down on the people that were kind of abusing the tourist visa. So they would come into the country. They were essentially living in Mexico, and they would come in and they would stay, 4 or 5 or just under that 6 month mark, because a lot of times you'll get 180 days when you come into Mexico, and then they would leave for a week or something like that, and then they would come back. And they were based on a perpetual tourist visa. And recently, Mexico started cracking down on that. Is that one of the reasons that you guys decided to go with temporary residency?
No, we actually started doing this before the crackdown, right before the crackdowns. So they really started cracking down on tourist visas anecdotally in around October 2021, and
Mm-hmm.
hearing more and more anecdotes, especially in November and in December.
Yeah. So I had quite a few clients reach out about that. And one of the, I hesitate to call it a loophole, but something that we're taking advantage of right now is Mexico has a program that if you are actually technically in the country illegally, as in your tourist visa has expired, they're allowing you the opportunity to immediately turn that into temporary or permanent residency. And a lot of my clients have been able to get permanent residency out of it, just by going to INM and applying. And essentially, what you need for that is you had to have been in Mexico in 2020 and have a visa from INM, and it's going to be in their system. They can look you up. But quite a few people are taking advantage of that right now, and it's an extremely cheap way to get your permanent residency in Mexico. And technically, you don't even have to be in Mexico to take advantage of that program. We've been able to get it for several of our clients that have already returned to the U.S.
Oh, wow.
It's not in the original idea of the program that the Mexican government had laid out, but it's still well within the regulation of how they created it that we can take advantage of it. Mexico tends to make it easier for people that want to live there, people that want to work there, contribute to the economy and everything else. There's a lot of countries in the world right now, particularly in the West, that seem to be shunning people that want to innovate and entrepreneurs and people with money. And then luckily there's countries like Mexico that are welcoming people like that with open arms. That's one of the things I
Definitely.
really appreciate about Mexico, not to mention in the last 2 years of craziness. At least from the statistics that I can find, they enforced the least regulations of any country in the world.
My thought for you, so it's kind of interesting that they're sort of tightening on the tourist visa, but they're being pretty generous with the residency visa. So that's one way you could look at it. Question for you: what's the situation in which people are getting permanent residency directly from the regularization? Because I've only heard of people getting temporary.
So we have a couple lawyers that are on our team in Mexico, and through them, we're able to get clients permanent residency as long as they've traveled to Mexico and have record with the INM in 2020. So as long as they've traveled there, and prior to this was a recent, very very recent change in the last week. Prior to that change, as long as they had been to Mexico once before, and I think INM could go back 3 years or something like that. So anytime in the last 3 years, if they had actually gone into Mexico, they were eligible for the permanent residency program that way. One thing I've learned about Mexico, and it applies to pretty much every LATAM country, is there's always a way, and it's not necessarily illegal. It's all within the bounds and confines of the regulation. But a lot of these regulations are purposely written pretty vague, so we can take advantage of certain loopholes. And this is one of the programs that we were using to our advantage and able to get clients their permanent residency. And a lot of times we were able to do it without them having to prove solvency, which is having a certain amount of money in their bank account or a certain amount of income every single month that wasn't location dependent, as in they
Right,
could
because
live
if
in
it's
Mexico.
solvency, so the people who are getting that you're aware of getting in under this regularization program that we're talking about, uh, are some of them also having to show solvency? Because in my mind, those are two different programs.
They are, and it depends on what INM agent that you end up talking to. A few of them will ask to make sure that you're economically solvent to actually live in the country and you're not going to be a burden on the system. It's not
Mhm.
the same thing as like the Pensionario Rentista visa, where you legitimately have to supply bank account statements, award letters, anything like that, and prove your solvency. They just kind of want a general idea that you do make a certain amount of money.
Okay, gotcha. Just sort of helps the agent sort of get over the hump that
Right.
that they feel comfortable signing the documents. And so, if these people are getting a permanent residency visa straight off the regularization, um, is that typically a two or 5 year, or what duration permanent residency is that, or does it have one?
This is where things get a little interesting. Depending on the INM agent and how they're feeling that particular day, you could get it could be a requirement to have 2 years permanent residency prior to applying for citizenship. It could be 1 year. We've had a few clients that, for whatever reason, it was 1 year that they had to be a permanent resident before they could apply for their citizenship. And in a couple cases, they had to do the full 5 years. But the vast majority of them didn't have to do the 5 years.
Okay, and I wasn't even asking about applying for citizenship after getting the residency, though that's a good question, and I'll follow up on that. But like, so let's just say you're coming off, you're in Mexico, you're on the tourist visa, you want to do regularization, and ideally permanent residency would be better than temporary, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Do temporary residencies have an expiry date? I'm pretty sure they do need to be renewed at some point, right?
I so rarely deal with the temporary. I want to say it's 10 years. It
For the
might be five
permanent.
years like permanent, for some reason I want to think it's 10. I don't know. We rarely ever have to deal with a temporary permit. The only ones that we've actually dealt with is if a client has a temporary residency permit and they want to exchange it for a permanent.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that about too. So you're definitely catching the questions. I haven't mentioned temporary yet. So let's just talk purely about permanent residency. Uh, and we could look this up, but does permanent residency have an expiration date in Mexico? Like, is it a 5 year permanent residency visa? Because some countries it's like forever, and some of them it is renewable after a certain period.
So theoretically, it's a 5 year expiration, but it's an automatic renewal.
Uh huh.
So if you get your permanent residency, the normal route, go through a consulate appointment, go down to your INM appointment, 3 to 5 weeks in country to get your plastic permanent residency card. It will expire in 5 years, but it's an automatic residency. You submit a form via the mail and it's automatically renewed. What most of our clients want to do, however, is take the next step and get into citizenship at the end of their whatever time period INM had said that they need to do permanent residency.
Got it. And before we get to the citizenship, so and then are the I guess the permanent residency, I guess, is typically always the same duration from what you're seeing. Like it's always the 5 year auto renewal. Is there such thing as like a 2 year perm residency or a shorter duration, or is it always 5 year?
If you go the traditional route and you schedule an appointment with your consulate in your country and then bring them all the paperwork, they sign off on you, then you make your INM appointment within 30 days in Mexico. If you go the traditional route, it's 5 years. Being able to utilize some of these programs that we've been discussing that Mexico has put forward, we can get it down to 2 years and in a few rare cases, 1 year permanent residency.
Prior to citizenship.
Yes. Well,
Got
and or renewal as permanent resident.
Got it. And then, so my other question was, because we kind of skipped temporary a little bit, because in my experience, most people getting in under regularization are receiving temporary permits. And in my experience, what's cool about it is what I've seen, at least typically through Quintana Roo, is that people are receiving 4 year temporary residence permits, which is cool because prior to this regularization program, my understanding is that most people who were applying for residency in Mexico were first receiving a 1 year temporary. So
Mm-hmm.
people used to only get a 1 year, and then and then on that first renewal, they would get a 4 year. They would get
Mm-hmm.
like a 3 or 4 year. And so what's cool about the regularization is the regularization people are actually skipping that 1 year and they're going straight into a 4 year in my experience. But I'm guessing that, different offices in different states might be issuing different time periods. So I was just wondering if what you had seen would line up with what I just described.
Honestly, and maybe it's because we're not applying for it that way, but very, very few of our clients actually get temporary residency. A few of them, just because of income and everything else, they were downgraded to temporary. And essentially, they were given a year to come up with the appropriate documents and everything else that they needed, and then they could reapply for permanent residency. What I found is it varies state by state. And even within the state, depending on what INM agent you speak to that day, like we have a
Mhm.
contact in INM Playa del Carmen, and we've been able to get a lot of our 2 year permanent residency permits through her.
Okay. Cool. So you've been typically getting permanent residency for people right off the bat, which is sweet. So let's just say I had a friend that had already gone through the program or was in Mexico for one reason or another, and they were already on a temporary residency permit. Are you able to uh, upgrade, quote unquote, that person or convert them into permanent residency? And if so, what would that process look like?
So a lot of times, our immigration lawyers that we have on our team in Mexico are able to get that done. Um, but again, as I've said multiple times, it really depends on the INM agent that you get that day. If they want to cooperate with you, then no problem. We've been able to upgrade quite a few permits. If you catch them on an off day, then you might as well just come back to INM a different day because you're not going to get anything done, or you're going to get the siesta sign when you try to go up to the window.
Gotcha. So hit or miss, but potentially possible to get converted from temp to
Yeah,
permanent.
a lot of our immigration agents have been doing it for quite a few years. So they have a lot of contacts in INM already. So a lot of it, 99% of it is going to get done via email and phone calls on their end prior to you ever stepping foot in INM. You'll already have an appointment set up. You're meeting with the correct INM agent, and it goes super smooth. That's not to say it's still LATAM. There are wrenches in the works some days. So
Okay. And what documentation would someone need to bring if they wanted to, I guess, A, do a cold from scratch application? And what would the documentation look from temp to permanent as we were kind of discussing? Would it be the same?
Excuse me. So if you want to do it, and by cold, I assume you're meaning straight from consulate in your country, and then go through the paperwork with them, and then go to Mexico and to your INM appointment.
Yeah, I guess there's like 3, 4 different scenarios, so it might be different for each one. But so let's just wrap the discussion on the temp to permanent because I think that is interesting and very rarely talked about. So if someone already had temp, they were already in Mexico and they wanted to upgrade to permanent, uh, is is it almost like a brand new process? What in would they need a police check and a birth certificate? What kind of information would someone need to do that?
9 times out of 10, you're not going to need any of that. They're going to want to have a couple copies of the signature page of your passport. And a few times they've actually requested bank statements. So a lot of times we just have our clients already have them and printed out. We haven't had an issue with them requiring translations and apostilles and everything so far. Um, we've been able to get around that. So it's been a really, really easy process upgrading most of our clients.
Okay, that's awesome. That sounds really cool. And so I guess to clarify for some people in my mind, some of the benefits, um, or maybe we could come back to the benefits later because that's like a bit of its own discussion, like pros and cons of temp versus permanent. Okay, and then for someone that was to apply from scratch, either they're already in Mexico on a tourist visa or they're in their home country, what is someone going to need to start applying for their very first Mexican residency?
So a lot of it depends on if you've traveled to Mexico in the last couple of years. If you have, then our immigration lawyers can typically get you permanent residency with by skipping the consulate visit, going directly to INM, and not having to submit near as much paperwork. If you, however, have not traveled to Mexico, then you're going to have to go through consulate in your country first, which most of them are at least 3 months out on appointments. Like the one here in Phoenix, I think is 6 months out right now. So you're going to have to wait around for your appointment. You're going to have to bring in notarized and apostilled um, passport documents, bank statements, any award letters from like Social Security, VA, your birth certificate, and a FBI background check for Americans. Now, essentially, our Canadian clients have to do their same thing, but through their government. So you're going to present all of this at your consular appointment. They're either going to give you, a go or a no go. If they give you a go, then within 30 days, you have to make an appointment within INM at any of the different INM locations in Mexico. Set your appointment there, and then bring all of the paperwork again. Check into the INM. They'll go over all your paperwork, give you a go or no go. If they give you a go, then you sit around for 3 to 5 weeks in Mexico waiting on your plastic permanent residency card. If you leave Mexico, the entire process starts over again, and you have to go and make another appointment at consulate.
Yeah. So while you can't leave while your thing's in progress while you're waiting on
Correct.
it.
So a lot of times with the other ones, if you've had travel to Mexico, what our lawyers are able to do is get all your INM stuff handled, get you your appointment, already have the docs, anything that they're going to need already done and at INM. You're gonna fly in Playa del Carmen, La Paz, one of those locations. You're gonna go to your appointment on Monday. Sign everything, go over everything, and then usually by Friday you can have your permanent residency card in hand and leave the country.
Okay, cool. And speaking of La Paz, I've heard that things work a little bit different in that office.
Very different, but it's different in every state. So
Yeah, I almost feel like, yeah, I don't know anything about some of the smaller states, but I've definitely, Quintana Roo has its own way of doing things. La Paz, Baja California Sur has its own way of doing things, not just with immigration, but even like different rules, like regarding like importing cars and stuff, are different in Baja.
absolutely, because
Um,
it's the tourist area all the way down almost. It's not
Yeah, and
like the
then
rest of Mexico.
correct. And then Mexico City, I think, is in a little bit of a league of its own. That doesn't mean it's more easier or more difficult, but it's like its own thing, sort of, the Mexico
Hmm.
City. And then the rest of the states, it's like a little bit like whatever, even down to like the city level, it's a little bit different everywhere. Um, the state of Morelos is actually famous for just having like cheap, the license plates.
Right.
And so when you're in Mexico, you'll actually notice seemingly very high number of Morelos license plates all over the place because it has the cheapest fee of any
Hmm.
state in Mexico. And so a lot of people just do it through Morelos to have a cheaper like renewal fee. So that's just like one random example of how things are a little bit different in different places. I've heard something about driver's licenses in Puebla, where and things like that. So it's just a little bit different in every state, and I guess that's part of the fun of being being in the offshore consultancy industry like yourself, is you get to find out these little quirks.
Yep, exactly. And that's why it's so important that we have an actual team on ground. I've seen a lot of these offshore companies that say that they're going to help people, but it's usually one or two guys based in the U.S. or based in Canada or based in the U.K. and don't have anybody on the ground in any of these countries to actually get anything done.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you're aware, having lived in Mexico and been to other LATAM countries, you can't get anything done unless you know some locals and they know how the actual process works. And even then, you're going to find siesta days where government employees don't want to do anything and you're not going to get anything done.
Do you have any other just like quick anecdotes of how things might work different in different states in like central Mexico?
So our two strongest teams is La Paz and Playa del Carmen. That's where we tend to do the most for stuff for our clients, just because that's where our teams are based.
Hmm.
That's where our immigration lawyers are. We have had to do a little bit of stuff in Jalisco for a client, so we started building out a team there. Um, Sinaloa, we had some stuff there. Sinaloa was a really interesting place to try to get anything done in. Um, and I kind of hesitate to say this, but that was probably the most corrupt government I've ever seen in Mexico.
So Sinaloa is home to Mazatlan, which is one of the most livable cities in Mexico. It's amazing on the beach, has direct flights from Canada and different places in the States. So lots of retirees are moving there. Awesome spot. But the capital of Sinaloa is Culiacan,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty notorious spot. So I'm guessing that any visa type stuff and any of this residency type stuff has to happen in Culiacan.
Yeah, and there was. I mean, it's not that unusual to be asked to pay a bribe when you're trying to get stuff done with government officials, and most of the time you can just tell them no, you're not going to pay it, and they don't even say anything about it. In that state, you could not get anything done without paying a bribe. Like it was just not going to happen. They would hang up on you, stop answering emails, everything.
This is what people are tuning in for. This is the content you won't hear anywhere else.
Right? And I don't want to take it to sound like I'm painting Mexico in a bad light or Sinaloa in a bad light. It was just for one particular client that we had to do some work in that area. That was what we ran into. And I know Mexico is kind of known for the bribes and things like that, but in all reality, it's actually gotten quite a bit better in the last 10 years. Um,
Hmm.
and personally, I don't really, 9 times out of 10, I don't care about a bribe. If federales stop you and they want $20, I don't care. That $20 is going to feed their family for the next 2, 3 weeks, maybe a month. What's $20 to you or I? Nothing. So, should you have to pay bribes and everything else? No, but it's kind of been a way of life in a lot of countries around the world. We're not going to change that anytime soon. And if it's not a big impact on your life, I don't really see a problem with it. Plus, it makes it a lot easier to get stuff done that you can't get done in the US or Canada or the UK.
Yeah, I definitely prefer like more of like a white hat approach, but it's definitely at very least it's like intellectually interesting to know where it might be different in different places. But all we can move on so we don't catch you in any say, in any saying anything you know I don't even know. But anyway, so okay, a couple things we can talk about. One would be sort of the benefits slash differences between temp and permanent residency, and then we can sort of talk a bit about the permanent resident to citizenship track. So let's start with the temp to permanent or temp versus permanent resident. So I think in my mind, one of the biggest benefits of being a temp resident and not a permanent resident is that you can drive a foreign plated car in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico as a temporary resident.
Correct.
So you can drive your Ontario or your Texas car in Mexico for, and you could be a temporary resident for like 4 years. So it could be like 4 years with your own car, you know, with your favorite sound system and all that in Mexico. But once you become a permanent resident, you no longer have that option. And as a permanent resident, you cannot drive a foreign plated car in Mexico. You'll have to basically like buy a car in Mexico or go through sort of like a formal car import process. That's my understanding.
That's the biggest difference. And I'll throw a personal anecdote in about this. If you're a permanent resident, you can have your car impounded if you're driving it on foreign plates. Okay. Now, here's the thing about importing your vehicle from northern North America, be it Canada or the US. It has to be 10 years of age or newer, and it has to have been manufactured within North America. So, under the NAFTA trade agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So a select few Toyotas fall into that, Ford, Chevys, Dodge, obviously. Unfortunately, what does not fall into that is a 2019 Jaguar F-Type, which is currently in my garage right now that I would love to have down in Mexico, but I can't take it down there.
Because it wasn't built in North America.
Correct.
Interesting.
And I don't want to get it impounded.
And so what? So let's just say you did have, you know, the Ford F-150 that is allowed to be imported. What would those fees look like?
Um, a
Is
lot
it
of it
like
is the
are they
value of the
paying like a
vehicle.
yeah? It's like the value times like 7% or whatever it is, like a IVA sticker tax, like a pretty
Almost like a
significant
VAT
amount.
tax. It's a
Yeah, like
fairly significant amount, but again, it's in pesos, so it's not really that big of an impact. Um, in a lot of cases, it's not worth it. The difficult thing is, though, unless you have significant cash resources, it's difficult to buy a vehicle in Mexico. We don't, obviously have the same credit rating system, so you might have a 720 in the United States, but that doesn't mean anything in Mexico. So it's not like you're going to be able to go and finance anything.
right.
Although on that note, I actually did just come across two different loan products for houses where you can actually get finance using your U.S. credit and purchase in Mexico. We have not used it yet, so I'll throw that caveat out there. But I have a few clients, and myself included, that sometime in the next few months are going to try that out, and then I'll have to let you know how that works so you can get that out to your viewers.
For sure. Yeah, I think there's a big market for um, the financing of like expats' homes abroad
Mm-hmm.
in Latin America, but that's a whole tangent. And another random anecdote is I think that the car vehicle import thing, there might be an exception in Baja California where a permanent resident might be able to drive their foreign car in Baja, but nowhere else in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Something,
It's
something
that
like
30
that.
miles from the border thing or 20 miles from
Oh,
the
really?
border, but all of Baja is included in that.
Fair enough. Yeah, so that's cool. Um, and then another potential, this is a bit of an advanced topic, but another potential benefit of being a temp resident and not a permanent resident might actually be in terms of like tax liability. Um, Even me bringing this up is sort of like a can of worms that would take a lot of time in this episode to sort of get into. But I would think that, let's just say you're a permanent resident, you're spending more than 6 months a year in Mexico. That kind of makes you like a full resident for residency based taxation purposes. Uh, I'm not an expert in these things, but that's my intuition. Whereas I think if you were just a temporary resident, it might be easier to make the case that it's not your tax home or whatever, or at least you're going to fly under the radar a little bit more. And so potentially from like a residency based taxation purpose, temp residency might be better, or lowering your exposure to some extent.
It could, but the caveat to that is your home country is still going to want to tax you,
Hmm.
particularly the U.S., because it doesn't matter, whether you're living in the U.S. or not, the IRS is going to go
Correct.
after you. Most of the rest of the world has residency-based taxation. So if you're spending more than 183 days in the country, they're going to try to get taxes out of you. If you're spending less than 183 days, say UK, Canada, they're not going to try to tax you. So you could do like a lot of my clients do what's called a trifecta. So they're going to have residency in 3 different countries. So therefore, they're not likely to spend more than 183 days per country, thus eliminating the majority of their tax liability. Now, even
Right.
if you
Yeah.
don't have residency in 3 different countries, and again, assuming you're not a U.S. citizen, a lot of times it can be much, much cheaper to actually adopt Mexico as your tax residency because it's significantly less taxes, personal and corporate taxes, than what you would find in UK or Canada. In the US, you can avoid a lot of it through, like what we were talking about the last interview, $118,000 paid out by your corporation that's based anywhere in the world, and you happen to be living outside the US. So even
Hmm.
for Americans, it can be tax advantageous to declare your tax residency in Mexico.
Hmm. And so, yeah, so let's just take the situation of like a Canadian or a European. Obviously, Americans is more complicated or unique, but a Canadian or European, if they were doing things smart, they would get residency in a territorial tax country. Let's just say Panama, but let's just say that they actually don't want to spend the whole year in Panama, and they want to spend some time in Mexico, and they also have residency in Mexico, right? So that's like someone performing like a proper trifecta strategy. They have Mexico as, maybe let's call it like a playground country, to use Five Flags parlance, and then they have like Panama or something as like a tax home flag, right? And I would think that if you were a temporary resident in Mexico, you could potentially spend more than 6 months of the year and still maybe fly under the radar. Whereas, and then everything's kind of done through Panama or whatever it is. But I think that if you're spending more than 6 months in Mexico as with the perm residency, that's sort of changing that dynamic a bit.
Absolutely.
I don't actually know like what the requirements are as like a temporary resident. I don't know like if would you know like do people need to file? Are Is tracking the days important as a temp resident as well, or do they sort of get a pass on a lot of these things?
Temporary residents get a pass. And to be totally honest, permanent residents, for the most part, get a pass. Mexico, and I'm not advocating that you don't pay your taxes. I mean, obviously, we're very much about staying on the legal side of governments with OCG. But even as a permanent resident, they don't have that massive long arm of the IRS that like the US does. So enforcement is next to nil. Now
Hmm.
that being said, there's still tax loopholes and ways that you can reduce your taxable liability to Mexico to essentially zero. Is sourcing most of your income offshore on the internet. You don't have Mexican employees. You don't have a Mexican-owned business. Income's not derived from Mexico. So taxes in Mexico are really, really dependent more on how much of your income is derived from the local economy.
Hmm. I do like, and yes, that is how it seems to be in practice. But I don't know. Obviously we don't want people to be in that kind of situation where they start treating Mexico like a territorial tax system when it's definitely not.
Mm-hmm. So even clients that have tried to declare, a lot of the tax agents and stuff in Mexico really aren't interested in seeing all of your offshore stuff.
Hmm.
So it's not, it's not a true territorial tax, but almost almost operates that way. For one thing, they don't have the personnel and staffing in order to be able to actually go through and see what you actually owe and try to figure it out, anything like that. So um, I've always been an advocate of, like the US wants 30 something percent of my income right now, which is ridiculous. But I don't mind paying 7 or 8% to a country like Mexico or a country like Georgia or Serbia, even. You know what I mean? To me, it's totally worth paying that 7 or 8% that they're asking for, because you're actually getting something in return, unlike the US, UK, Canada, Western Europe in general.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. So hopefully that is helpful for people to hear a little bit about the differences between temp and permanent residency. There's some other potentially I'm trying to think what would be some of the benefits of being a permanent resident over temporary. Obviously, it's longer duration. It's probably easier to renew, things like that. But
The biggest are probably bank accounts and owning property.
okay. Yeah. Tell me about how I don't know of any differences between temp and permanent in those categories. So please tell me.
So a lot of banks, if you only have temporary residency, are not very keen on opening bank accounts for you, opening investment accounts for you. You can rent property under a temporary residency,
Mhm.
um, but in a lot of situations, it's difficult to buy property on a temporary residency. Banks and whatnot would much rather
You
see
mean for
you as a permanent
financing?
resident. No, not just for transferring money into the country, cash, and purchasing a property. Um,
Huh.
Particularly when you have to do it in a trust.
Okay. Because you don't even need to have any residency or immigration status in Mexico to buy property in Mexico or to set up a trust.
Correct. But the process is much, much more simplified if you actually have your permanent residency. You pretty much flash your permanent residency card and you negate about 20 of the requirements. A lot of the background checks and the due diligence that they're going to do on where your money came from and how it came into the country.
Hmm.
So being a permanent resident negates a lot of that.
Okay, interesting. And so a temporary resident would almost go into that same bucket as someone with no status, where they'd be subject to greater like background checks and things like that.
In our experience, yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, coming back to the bank accounts, though, I've asked around quite a bit, and all the banks I've asked about it seem to have no problem opening a bank account for a temporary resident as long as you have like a water bill.
Hmm. Yeah, and a lot of that depends on which bank you go to, and also their international presence. For a lot of the clients, they're trying to bank internationally because they've got like a Seychelles or a Belize or a BVI corporation. They're doing their banking out of Portugal or something like that, and then they need a local account. So if you've got permanent residency and you're sourcing your income from offshore, and you got offshore accounts, and you've got transfers coming in from offshore, then it just makes it a lot easier for the bank to approve everything for you and not hold your money for long periods of time when you get a large transfer if you're a permanent resident.
Okay, interesting, interesting. Um, this is definitely good stuff. I was not aware of some of this. Any other benefits of being a permanent resident?
Ability to apply for citizenship in a couple years. And I know
Yes,
not everybody
good
wants to do that,
segue.
but I cannot wait until the day that I've got Mexican citizenship and a Mexican passport. To me, that's going to be one of the best days of my life.
Yeah, very good segue. So, you can't, one cannot apply directly from temp resident to citizenship. They have to become a permanent resident first. And I think, I don't know if there's like a minimum time period as a permanent resident. If so, it's only 1 year, I think.
It used to be
Could be
5, but under the Regulario
or
stuff,
five
we're
years
getting it
total perm or, sorry, go ahead.
5 years as a permanent resident before
Really?
you were eligible to apply for citizenship. But under the new programs, we've seen it cut down to as short as a year. And never having had temporary residence, you've only had permanent residency for a year, and then they'll make you eligible to apply for citizenship.
That's extremely generous.
Extreme. That's one of the reasons I recommend Mexico so much for my clients. Is it's so much easier to get permanent residency and citizenship and stuff done in this country than anywhere else in the world. And you're getting it done in an amazing country that people would actually want to live in. You're not doing it in.
Nicaragua.
Well, I liked Nicaragua. I'd buy a big old finca out there. No, I'm talking like any of the stands or anything like that. It's a
Sure,
country you
sure,
actually want to live in.
sure. No, that sounds extremely, extremely generous. It almost if someone is a temporary resident and they're just saying, "Oh, I'll just wait out the 4 years, then I'll become permanent, and then it's just 1 year permanent, 5 years to citizen." Well, if you could exchange your temp for a permanent, like now, and then cut off that whole temp period and just start sort of waiting that 1 or maybe 2 years for Mexican citizenship, and that ups the timeline by 2 3 years. I would definitely say that would be worth the legal costs of the conversion.
I would agree. And then the other thing to consider is Western countries are trying to crack down on this. You see them doing it with Russian citizens currently, those that hold residency permits in other countries. Look at what Canada was doing, freezing assets of its people. Um, the U.S. is trying to make it extremely difficult for dual citizenship holders for taxes, and also if you ever decide to renounce your U.S. citizenship, they're going after Malta for their dual citizenship program. They've gone after the Caribbean in the past.
Yep, I
These big
see that.
Western countries want to keep you inside of their tax net. They do not want
Mm.
you escaping to these other tax havens, as they like to call it, and they'll make up all kinds of excuses. It's Russian oligarchs today, but last year it was only criminals and drug traffickers and human traffickers go and get second passports and have residency in tax havens. It's not true. I know hundreds and hundreds of businessmen that with legitimate businesses that do this every day.
Mhm.
So eventually, these Western countries are going to have their way. And in the last couple of years, mainly during all the COVID thing, they've really, really been pushing these other countries hard to start getting rid of these programs or start making like residency and things like that much more difficult to attain. So what I've been telling people is, particularly in Mexico right now, you have the best opportunity of your life to get it done now, because in the future you may not have this option.
100%. Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of doors close. We're seeing, like you said, pressure on some of the citizenship by investment programs and all the residency programs that are out there. They just keep making it a little bit incrementally harder every year. They up the income requirement. They add a couple new things you need. It's just never really going to get easier. Like, yeah, some programs will ideally hopefully come along and say, you know what, we're going to streamline this hardcore, we're going to make it super super simple. um, but definitely the trend is, for 200 companies that aren't bucking the trend, it's going to be making it harder.
Absolutely.
um, and then so one question I had about the permanent resident to citizenship track. that we've discussed. We actually touched on this in our first episode as well. Is that I think you mentioned that there's no actual physical presence requirements for becoming a citizen through this path. And to help tee up this question, um, I understand that. So for the baby path, where you can have a baby in Mexico and become an instant permanent resident in Mexico by having a baby, if you want to then become, if those parents want to then become citizens in Mexico, my understanding is they have a physical presence requirement of 18 of the next 24 months in order to qualify for citizenship. So if you did that baby residency to citizenship path. Apparently, that has physical presence requirements, from what I understand. But it seems like these other tracks might not have a physical presence requirement.
And that's one of the other reasons that I recommend Mexico so much for my clients is unlike almost every other country in the world, it does not have any on the ground residency requirements while you're a temporary or a permanent resident on your path to citizenship. Almost every other country requires you to be there. Some of them are only a week. Some of them are 6 months. Some of them require you to spend the majority of the year in that country in order to maintain your residency. Mexico went the absolute opposite direction and said, we don't care if you're here or not. Come in, pay our fines and fees, get your residency card, and we'll see you in 3 to 5 years when you want to reapply.
Yep. And yeah, there's kind of two pieces to it. There's physical presence to maintain the residency. So, for example, in Panama, you have to spend like 2 days every 2 years in Panama to maintain the residency. But that's not really going to put you citizenship track because
Mm-hmm.
at least in Latin America, it's not just okay, like the boxes have been checked, boom, here's your stamp, here's your passport. It's more of sort of like a holistic uh approach where you're sort of like judged based on your ties, and they kind of look at like, you know, what are the ties here? Does this person own property? Is this person married? Does this person like have a job and income in the country? And there's sort of like looking at this sort of like holistic picture to see if it's someone that they want to be a citizen, to see has this person like made a significant investment in integrating themselves and integrating into the country. And so you see it working that way in Panama, in Uruguay, in Paraguay. Lots of different places are kind of like that, where you really have to like show that you made an effort. And so, kind of what's cool about this Mexico program is it sort of seems to stand in contrast to that, where yeah, it doesn't seem to have as much of a physical presence requirement, and it doesn't seem to be like this big whole like holistic integration type vibe.
Right. The other thing that I'll touch on real quick is most of these other countries require an extensive test in order to get your citizenship. You have to prove that you are basically fluent in whatever language it is that that country speaks. You have a probably better knowledge of the country's history than a natural born citizen does. Um, Whereas in the case of Mexico, for the couple of clients that we've managed to take them all through citizenship so far, the Mexican citizenship test is a basic understanding of Spanish and a basic knowledge of Mexican history.
Yeah, I don't think that'll be like a big issue for people. I mean, if you're gonna naturalize, you should probably know at least like when the revolution was and a couple things. Like it's not that big a deal, I feel. Although obviously it does take a little bit of time to probably study for it. But I find for a lot of countries, like they've been using the same questions for like years and years, and
It's
there's
all on the
some
internet.
info. Yeah, there's kind of some info on the internet about what it's about, and you just kind of know like know the main rivers and stuff like that. Okay, another quick question about this. So you said that some people, there's an indication that you can apply for the naturalization after 1 year of permanent residency. For some people, it's like 2 years after. I mean, where does this indication come from? Like, how do you kind of know if you can apply for naturalization or not?
INM will tell you. So in our case, we'll set our client up with one of our lawyers in either one of those locations. They'll go handle all of the paperwork and communication with INM. And obviously, they're attempting to get the least amount of permanent residency possible for our clients. But ultimately, INM will come back and say 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1 year. We have, as of yet, had an INM agent that was willing to go with none, but we're still hoping.
Gotcha. And so for the citizenship stuff, is it different? So residencies can be processed in the state, so in Baja, in Quintana Roo, et cetera. Um, are citizenship naturalization processes all done in Mexico City, or is a portion of that done at the state level as well?
From what we've had to deal with so far, any INM in any state can actually handle it for you. Now, ultimate approval comes from federal government, but you're swearing in, and all of the paperwork is going to get handled at a state level.
Okay, that's cool. That kind of makes it easier for the person. They don't have to travel to Mexico City, and it also makes it easier in the sense that you're dealing with the same office with which you've probably built a bit of a relationship, both you and your lawyer. So they'll kind of know who you are a little bit more. They'll have your records on file, and you'll have
Mm-hmm.
a bit more of a personalized interaction.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, that all sounds awesome. I know we were almost thinking about talking about a couple different countries in this episode, but you know what? Like we've already done an hour on Mexico. This is pretty much just the Mexico episode, and I'm happy with that because this has been an extremely high value episode. I'm trying to think what else when it comes to Mexico and citizenship, residency, things like that. Is there anything else we haven't covered? Any important topics that we should touch upon?
Let's talk about cost real quick.
Mhm.
So there's two options to do this. One, you can do it all entirely on your own. Set up your own consulate appointments, get all of your own documents translated and apostilled. Um, make your own INM appointment within 30 days to go down to Mexico. And all of that, honestly, will cost you less than $1,000. Not counting your airfare and hotel and lodging when you're in Mexico, because you're going to have to stay there 3 to 5 weeks. If you go through a lawyer, it's typically going to cost you 3,000 to 5,000, depending on how your individual case is, and how long it takes. If you go through us, we have an option where for $1,500, that's not counting your legal fees and your INM fees and fines. Uh, but we'll walk you through, which, to be totally honest, is essentially what we just did in this interview. But we'll walk you through the entire process. We'll help you fill out all the paperwork. We will put you in contact with our team on the ground.
Mhm.
So the biggest thing is that they're trustworthy. Just picking somebody randomly off the internet is a good way to lose your money. And I don't care if it's Mexico, Belize, Georgia, Romania, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of scams in this space. So probably the biggest benefit we provide is we know and we have teams in place down there to keep you and your money safe.
And often
So
it's like a shorter processing time between. Let's say, thank God, even if someone was able to. So there's a couple reasons that you would want to work with a lawyer or work with a team. One is if you make any sort of mistake with your paperwork, you'll have to start again from scratch, and you might need to go get new papers, things like that. So that's a huge time saver and potential and reduction of risk. Another one is your application might get processed faster. So after being submitted, it might be in a different stack that gets processed faster
it
because
absolutely will be.
it's in the people we have relationships with stack versus the random broke people stack. So your thing is going to get processed faster as well. And if there's any mistakes or things like that, There's let's just say randomly, like they spelled your middle name slightly wrong when the residency gets issued. Well, if you have a relationship and you have a team of lawyers, they can probably get that corrected without too much issue. But if you did it yourself, that would be another like huge huge headache.
There's a good possibility it would be round filed and you'd have to start again.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience using the lawyer, I think there are potentially maybe some countries where you could do it yourself, and I'd say, look, just like do it yourself, save the money, blah blah blah. I'd say Mexico is definitely one of the countries where you probably should use someone. Like it's not going to cost that much money, and the relationships make a huge difference.
I would agree. Although I'll add, there's very few countries in the world that I would go about it on my own. We have teams of lawyers and agents and things in place in the majority of the countries that we help clients with. And that's the only way to get things done. Trying to go in blind and randomly pick somebody and hope everything turns out for the best is not a great plan of action.
Right, and you would need to speak Spanish to do it yourself for sure.
Yeah, if you
So
don't speak
yeah,
Spanish, they make it a lot more difficult for you.
yeah. So there's I guess a couple of reasons. So we talked a little bit about the cost. How much did you say it would cost if you did it yourself? Like maybe like $1,000
Less than
less,
$1,000. I want to say the
like 500
filing
bucks.
fee $47 to go to your consulate appointment. It's like 235 to file for your residency. Another 360 something dollars for the actual card, and then some little
Yeah,
miscellaneous 15, 20, $25 fees. All in all, it's
yeah,
under $1,000.
for
But it's a
sure. Birth
massive headache
certificate,
that
police
takes
report.
months.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
you got
is.
to send all
You'd
that
have to
paperwork out
dedicate a lot of
yourself.
time. You'd have to dedicate a lot of time. You'd have to have your perfect Google Drive file and all this type of
Hmm.
stuff, and you'll be scrolling Facebook groups for hours, like looking for random nuggets of information. So don't I definitely don't recommend that just to save like 2 or 3 grand.
No, it's not worth it.
Not worth it. Okay, so costs around $1,000 if you do it yourself. If you hire a lawyer, looking at, I know people that all in it costs less than $2,000. So call it like two, but whatever. Call it 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. Sort of depends what
In
on a
order to
couple
get the
factors.
better permanent residency time periods. So if you went with the standard, and you may or may not have to do your consulate visit, but you're going to hold your permanent residency for 5 years prior to being eligible for citizenship, that it literally is the cheapest option when you're dealing with a lawyer. The other options, the 3, 2, and 1 year permanent residency options, there is a substantial upcharge for those. And I'm not 100% sure if it goes to the lawyer, goes to the INM agent, goes to the government. I tend not to ask too many questions about that kind of thing, but there is a little bit of an upcharge.
Yeah, I could see them wanting. I could see permanent costing a little bit more than temporary. Let's put it that way.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's cool. So talked about costs. Um, oh, maybe we could talk a little bit about specifically for people who are nearing retirement age and they're looking to Mexico specifically as a retirement destination. And they're concerned maybe about getting access to their pension when they're down there. They're concerned about real estate purchases. They're concerned about what's going to happen to my 401k. Do I lose my social security? There's a lot of like sort of retirement specific questions. And I think retiring people is actually probably one of the bigger markets for these services. So, what are you seeing as um, some of the biggest concerns that people in this demographic are facing, and what are your thoughts on that?
Probably the rising costs of proving solvency in Mexico. So every year, Mexico increases the amount, and it's the minimum wage of Mexico multiplied by some number. So obviously, minimum wage in Mexico goes up every single year. But what we've figured out is depending on what consulate you go to for your initial appointment when you're trying to get like your pensionado rentista visa, um,
Hmm.
Phoenix consulate wants you to prove that you have $4,300 a month income. Now, that income can be Social Security, VA benefits, disability, long term annuity payouts, retirement payouts from large corporations. It doesn't really matter where the funds are coming from, so long as you can show a track record of them being deposited into your account for at least a year, and the deposits have to equal or exceed the minimum required by the U.S. by the Mexico government. Now, that being said, like I said, Phoenix consulate wants $4,300 a month. We found out that the Washington D.C. consulate is still operating on the old rules, and they only want to show you to show $2,300 a month. So there's something to be said about contacting multiple consulates. Now realize that you may have to travel in order to take advantage of it. But if your income is really close to the minimum level, you may want to look at other consulates just to make sure that your application goes through. And unlike the majority of countries, you can actually go straight into permanent residency that way.
Okay. And so you can go straight into permanent through the, would this be the rentista or just through a solvency path? Or is this
Rentista has the
pensionado?
solvency.
Is this
Yeah,
pensionado
Rentista.
or rentista that we're talking about?
Rentista.
Okay.
The pensionado is almost exactly the same uh, monetary requirements. Let's see, residente permanente.
And so this can be earned income as well, right? From a job?
Yes. But if it's earned income from a job, depending on the consulate and depending on the individual agent that you're talking to, they may or may not want proof that this income will continue if you were to move to Mexico.
Right. And I think you mentioned that in the previous episode, but that's still cool because that actually works for digital nomads and anyone that works online. Um, Maybe I can come back to that after we finish some more thoughts about retirement.
Yeah,
Um,
the biggest thing about that is there's no actual age requirement, so you don't have to be 65 or older to qualify for any of those programs.
mhm.
You just have to have minimum income coming in every single month. It's just typically applied to retirees, so that's why the program's called that.
Definitely. I think another big concern for retirees would be healthcare. So I'm sure you've had clients ask about that. How's the healthcare in La Paz? How's the healthcare in Quintana Roo? What does health insurance look like? Um, yeah,
So, in my experience, the healthcare in Mexico is at the same level or above the majority of what you're going to get in the US. A lot of the doctors and nurses are actually US educated, speak excellent English.
hmm
And medical tourism is huge all around the world. But Mexico, in the last few years, has actually become a very, very popular spot for that just because of the quality of care. We're talking first world technologies, better cancer screening and cancer treatments than the US has available. They don't have a lot of the same issues with the FDA that we have here. So they have access to a lot of different treatments and medicines that we won't get here in the US.
hmm
And the cost is 10%. 15% in some cases. I mean, I had a client, excuse me, I had a client that had a cancer diagnosis here in the US, and they were looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. So instead of doing everything in the US, they went and flew to a half a dozen different places in the world. One, to make sure that they actually did have cancer, because a big issue in the US is doctors telling you you have cancer and it come to find out you never did, although they just made a bunch of money off you.
Is that a thing? I did not know that.
That is absolutely a thing right now. So they flew all around the world and found the doctor that they felt the most comfortable with that was an agreeable price. And what would have cost over $200,000 in the US cost them $36,000 for better care and treatment.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. I actually have a buddy that lives like on the Texas Mexico border, and they go to Texas to get all their prescriptions and stuff.
Same
So,
here in
and
Arizona.
any like x-rays or anything. So if you need like, yeah, if you need anything from x-rays to dental work to
Hmm.
like random pill prescriptions, most people go to Mexico to get that done.
Yeah, exactly same thing here. There's more Americans in Algodones getting dental work done than Mexicans. That's it's a town literally right over the border here in Arizona. So
Random question, have you been to Nogales?
yes, several times I've gone through that port of entry a bunch of times. I used to live down by Tucson.
Uh-huh. I've heard, I haven't been there, but I've heard that Nogales is actually a really, really nice town. This is on the Mexican side. And if you cross into the American side, it's like the worst town ever. And it's so it's like it's kind of a funny dynamic where the Mexican side is actually nicer than the American side.
Yes and no. Some of the coolest houses I've ever seen in Arizona are actually in Nogales on the U.S. side. Beautiful old 1800s houses and things,
Mhm.
beautiful woodwork and all that, and cheap. Like, 70, 80, $90,000 for a house, which in the U.S. right now is unbelievable. The average home price in Arizona is $350,000 right now. So
Mhm.
to get that quality of house at that price is absolutely amazing. But there's not much in that town, and almost everybody lives on the Mexican side and then goes to work on the U.S. side.
Mm. Yeah. Random aside there. Okay, and then I actually had another question about income. So I guess this is going to be a question about other countries in Latin America. So it's very cool that with the Mexican program, you can use earned income to apply for some of these visas because that works perfectly for digital nomads. Um, I've been looking at the programs in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and some of the Central American countries, uh, things like that. And uh, it seems that, at least on paper, they don't want to see earned income. They really want to see a steady source of passive income, be it a certificate of deposit. It could be real estate rental returns. It could be a pension or social security. Do you know anecdotally um, of any countries where you could actually apply with earned income, and then therefore it would be more advantageous for like younger digital nomad types?
All of those places. So here's the thing. Just because a country's website says one thing, in reality, it's often quite different. So when you're talking to their version of INM and you're showing them earned income, it might require a slight argument with the INM agent or a $50 fine that you pay in order for your earned income to qualify. 9 times out of 10, there's really not going to be an issue with it. Because in reality, these countries want and need your money inside those countries. So they're not going to turn people
True.
away based on some regulation. It's one of the other reasons I like LATAM so much is there's some common sense involved. You go to US, UK, Canada, the agent's going to look at the black and white of the book, and you're not going to get any common sense. It is so overregulated in these areas that there is no human connection really left. They cannot go outside the black and white. Whereas places like LATAM, there's still the absolute human connection. And, see how sometimes that human connection might require a $50 fine to the government in order to use that your earned income to qualify, but you have that option. And I like
Right.
living in a place with options.
That's awesome. Yeah, I like the sound of that. And I kind of generally thought that to be the case, but I was wondering if you know any places that might be better than others. We actually briefly mentioned this in the first episode in Colombia, and how in Colombia that might be the case as well, depending on who you get as your agent. They might accept earned income for the rentista style visa in Colombia, right?
Yes. And a lot of that comes down to what lawyer you choose and what kind of relationship that they've developed with the INM office, the immigration office.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times they can make something go through that on paper there's no way it should.
Makes sense. And then once you're in, you're in. Because if you, let's just say that one of these visas. It's often called a rentista visa. And let's just say that leads to like a temporary resident. Once you're in on the temp, it doesn't really matter what your income sources are anymore. Like you'll get the permanent when your time comes.
So on paper, it actually says you have to requalify every single time that you reapply. So whether you got it for a 3 year, 4 year, or 5 year, you're supposed to reapply with new income documents in order to prove that you're making the amount of requested by the government based on the minimum wage increases. In our experience, nobody's been asked for that. Once you've already have a permit, you're golden.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, this is good stuff. This is I think people will find this pretty interesting because, and what's cool is you can basically use that same income source like several times. So, uh, like it's not like you need 4,000 for Colombia and then another 4,000 for Nicaragua and then another 4,000. You can just use that same income source to qualify for several different programs.
Oh yeah, and then start looking farther overseas, and then start hitting up Eastern Europe. So that way you can go spend summers in Eastern Europe and go spend winters in LATAM.
Or just go to South America where it's the reverse hemisphere. So
Right?
you can go to Mar del Plata, Argentina. You go to Punta del Este, Uruguay. You go to Brazil. You go to Chile. It's a good
Yep.
time.
I had a lot of fun at Argentina. It was also some of the coldest places I've ever been to. I rode a motorcycle down to Tierra del Fuego. That was a miserable trip. It's something that if you're a long distance motorcyclist, you have to check off your list. But that was a miserable trip. I have no desire to ever do that one again.
I don't think you've ever mentioned that you did that. Where did you start? You did the whole Pan America, or
So Cartagena, Colombia. I picked up. So I had already ridden all the way down to Guatemala. Put the bike on a ship and shipped it to Cartagena. Then I had to go back to the States. Go back to work for a few months, and then flew back down to Cartagena. Got my bike out of storage and rode it all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. I had started up in Washington, up in Seattle. But I've also
wow,
ridden across Africa, and I've ridden a lot of Eastern and Western Europe as well.
all on a bike?
Yep.
Whoa, Cartagena de Tierra del Fuego. That's a good ride.
Yeah, that took a little while. And everything was amazingly beautiful until you get to the Altiplano, Argentina. And then it just turns miserable.
Huh. And this is almost like the outro, but and that wait, where have you done in Africa?
So I started in Johannesburg, rented a bike. I've been to, and not all on the same trip, Nairobi, Ethiopia, the Z one that I always forget where I got to see the lions,
Zimbabwe.
Egypt, Guinea, the other French colony that I never remember the name of, probably a couple
Togo.
other places too. I enjoyed that a lot. Ethiopia was probably the most beautiful country I've been to in Africa.
Yeah, a lot of people like it.
Yeah, the Z one that I can never remember the name of though. They put us in a glass box in the middle of the night on a game preserve, and Pride of Lions comes through. So they got all the night vision and all that stuff for us. And you get the big male lion, and he's rearing up on his hind feet, and he's smacking the glass and stuff, right? And the whole thing's rattling. And that was a little scary. And then you realize that the female lionesses are up on top of the glass, and they're smelling every single corner, every edge. And you know that their brain is working. They're trying to figure out a way to get inside just to eat you. And that's when it was really got scary.
That sounds like a vibe.
It was a good time.
So let's start wrapping up this episode. Where can people find you if they're interested in working with you, looking for your services?
Offshore Consulting Group LLC.com is my website. I am not particularly techie, and there is a few things that I've been told that don't work correctly on my website. So I've got a website guy trying to fix that for me. So if you go there and it's not perfect, I'm sorry. Twitter is probably absolutely the best way. And that is, you would think I would know my own Twitter handle. At Martin Toomey 13. So I just use my personal Twitter.
Yep. And Toomey is Toomey.
Correct.
Cool. Random question. Where do you get, like, where do most of your clients come to you from? Like, how do they hear about you?
Right now, well, a lot of them come off Twitter. But right now, the majority of my clients are Canadian. The Canadians are so scared of their government right now that they're fleeing in droves. Anybody with the money is getting out, and the U.S. isn't far behind. I mean, we got still a substantial amount of Americans leaving, but Canadians are leaving in a flood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Martin, this has been an awesome episode. I think people will have gotten a lot of episode, a lot of value out of this episode. Big deep dive on Mexico. I'm still processing because we went over a lot of good stuff, and I have a couple things that I learned. I learned a lot on this episode, and I have a few things I'm going to be following up with you about.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you having me on again. As always, it's a great pleasure to talk to you and to reach out to your audience. And I hope we get to do this again in the future.
Absolutely, man. So thank you for being our first repeat guest. Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast here with Martin Toomey. Thanks for watching.